Hey everybody, we're just going to give kind of our other attendees, the other people we're expecting a minute to join. While we're waiting, if anybody could say, or if everybody could say where you're joining from and what your experience with Hex is in the chat, that'd be great. Super helpful for me to tailor the demo. Long Beach, that's cool. My wife is from Irvine, so we're kind of down there a couple times a year. Oh, and Houston. My sister's in Houston, so I'll probably be out there soon. Ooh, London. That's nice. That's great. I would love to go to London. Cool. All right. So it looks like we have reached quorum. So I'm going to get started. Um, so my name is John Conway. I'm a solutions engineer with Hex. So this is clearly How to Hex. This is our regular demo series where we show off some features of Hex, usually under some theme. And then at the end, we will have some time for me to answer any questions that you might have about Hex, kind of broadly, or the things that I'm talking about today. And so today's theme is Hex versus traditional notebooks. There's a ton of things that make Hex better, nicer, easier to use, more collaborative than traditional notebooks. Today, we're just focusing on three areas because it would be crazy to try to talk about every single little thing. Those three areas are scale. So that's kind of some features we've built into Hex about how to use Hex with larger data sets, things that make it easier, more scalable. Then we'll talk about state. That's really going to be about our execution model. So that's how that's different from traditional notebooks, some of the benefits and some of the things, the ways that you can use that in Hex. And then lastly, I will talk about sharing in Hex. And I'll come at that from two different perspectives. There's the idea of sharing like you have an insight, you have a result, you have something you want to share with somebody who would benefit from that insight. And then there's also sharing in the sense of like collaborating with other people on a project. And I'm going to cover both of those when we get to that in the demo. After I cover all of that, we should have like 10, 15 minutes for questions. Happy to talk about anything Hex related at that point. And so here, I'll double check the chat. No experience with Hex. Perfect. Okay, so that's great. So right as I get started, I'll do a little bit of table setting for anybody who's not super familiar with Hex. I'm not going to go into like every single little bit of how to do every kind of thing, but hopefully a good overview to get everybody oriented here. So this is a Hex project. Pretty much this whole demo is going to take place in this Hex project. You can think of a Hex project as mapping to a notebook. Even at the top, you can see notebook right here. So for some users, for some people, for some use cases, Hex acts as a notebook. You can see that we have our cell-based workflow here. You work with data. This is the primary data workspace in Hex. The project mapping to a notebook could be like a use case or a question that you might have. The reason it's not just a notebook, as you can see up here, is because the project also includes an app. And the app you can think of as the product that you might share out with other people if you are planning on sharing out the work that you're doing with other people. This is kind of a curated output generated from the things that you did in the notebook. That's more polished, nicer, it's interactive, but it kind of maybe keeps people who don't need to see every single line of code out of the notebook. Uh, and so I'll start, most of this will take place, most of the demo is going to be over here on the notebook side of the project. And when I think about Hex as a notebook, one thing that I want to cover really, really quick before I get too deep into it is that if you are coming to this from the perspective like replacing a Jupyter notebook with Hex, you can go over here. Sorry, I clicked through this pretty quick. This is our main home screen. Over here, we have this import button. So if you do have an IPYNB file from a Jupyter notebook that you wanted to use as a starting point for a project, you can upload that here super easily and get going with that as a starting point. Once you're in the notebook, like I am here, whether you're starting from scratch or whether you have uploaded an IPYNB file, you can click in between any cells. You can see all the different cell types we have. So immediately, if we're thinking of Hex versus Jupyter Notebook, there's all these other kinds of cells that we have. But kind of as a one-to-one replacement for a Jupyter Notebook, you can see that you could do everything in Python and Markdown if you really wanted to. And so yeah, clearly there's a ton of differences, like lots of little workflow things, big improvements over Jupyter Notebooks. One of the biggest is the SQL experience here, and this is really going to tie into working with bigger data sets. To start by writing SQL in Hex, over on the left, you can see our data connections. So Hex as a data tool, as a place to work with data, has a really nice kind of managed data connection area over here. You can see all of the workspace connections that I have access to. I can create a new connection up here really easily. But this demo is all going to take place in this demo Snowflake connection. And this is pretty straightforward, like bread and butter SQL stuff. I think it's kind of expected. It's like table stakes if you're working with SQL or working with a data warehouse. Still not really nicely available in a Jupyter notebook. And so you can see all of this over here. Schema browser, I can search across it. I can pin stuff. So this is like setting up bookmarks where I can say I use this demo database all the time. It becomes easy to use. Really where most of the real work is going to be, though, is going to be when you start connecting to the data and working with it. And so I showed really quickly all of these different cell types. Really, the big one that I want to talk about right now is our SQL cell. The SQL cell is a full SQL editor that we have built into the notebook. So the same way that you might open up a Python cell and say, like, I'm doing Python. Oh, horrible choice doing the single quote, but I'm still going to make it work. And you can see I'm doing Python here. You could also write SQL. And so when you spin up a SQL cell over here, you can see in the top right corner, I can pick my data sources. So here's all the available ones. Here's the one that I'm using. And like you see below, really, it's straightforward. You write SQL, we send it to Snowflake, and you get the results back. The workflow here and just the user experience is a lot better than wrapping this up in like Python for SQL Alchemy. You can see that we're getting syntax highlighting. I can link out to my data browser. There's custom formatting. There's all kinds of little things, but really you're writing SQL, you get the results back here. And kind of the backbone or the foundation of the Hex workflow is that when you get these results back, they're available from this variable name down here. So you can name it whatever you want. I just double click this, I can purchases, and then I can give it all this stuff. But I'm just going to keep it as purchases. And this is a pandas data frame. And so if I do print, let's do this. Type purchases, you can see it's a pandas data frame. So it's very, very natural in Hex to work with SQL and then go right into doing things in Python here with a pandas data frame. So the SQL to Python workflow is like way better in Hex than it is with the traditional notebook. And kind of taking that further, we have a lot of functionality built into this to make it easier to scale up with data. So it's not just that you can take this purchases and write Python against it. There's a ton of other tools. You can see that you can visualize in this chart. We have a pivot table. You can filter this down. All of this stuff that maybe you could do in Python manually, but we make it easy to do without Python if you don't want to. For us today, the important thing that I want to talk about is querying these results again with SQL. So it's not like in kind of the Python world or the Jupyter world or the traditional notebook world where you were to wrap something up in SQL Alchemy, pull things back into a pandas data frame, and now you're in pandas world, whether you like it or not. In this case, in Hex, I can write this SQL cell. I get my result back. We named it purchases, and I can query this again with SQL. So we call this feature chain SQL, where you take SQL, you write SQL, you get an output, and you write SQL against that output. And where this ties into scale is with the feature that we call query mode. So suppose I have a data set. I'm going to come up here. I'm going to create a new SQL cell. I'm just going to copy this down here. And let's do select star from. So this is maybe going to make some people cringe, but this data set's not too big, right? It's like, I don't know, it's a million rows. It's about, I don't know, half a gig. We can move this over the wire kind of reasonably in a couple of seconds. And this is, I don't know, maybe okay for this table, but this is not a scalable solution. Like at a certain point, pretty quickly, most of our customers, most of our users are working with data that you just reasonably can't select star and pull the data over the wire. And so what I can do here in Hex, instead of pulling all this over the wire, is I can switch this to query mode. And so once I switch this over to query mode, you'll see instead of pulling that 800,000 row data set back, we're just pulling back a 100 row query preview. And so this is named query. I'm gonna rename this query result, or let's call this intermediate result. And so I can take this intermediate result, and just like I did below with that chain SQL where I can write SQL against my SQL, I'm going to take this output, I'm going to query it with SQL, and I get this, and I'm going to change this up a little bit. Let's do select event type, and let's just do simple count star here. Let's do group by event type. And so in this case, I'm aggregating this data set. And you'll see here, when I get this count star back, this is showing the results from the full 800,000 row data set. So in Hex, as you're writing SQL against these SQL results, using query mode, you can use these really big data sets. You don't have to have a perfectly formed query up front. You don't have to pull all of this into memory. You can take this, take a look at it, and build off of it downstream. And so you can see here that once I build off of this again, I'm getting my 800,000 row data set back, even though I only pulled this 100 row preview to begin with. So this makes it way easier to work with bigger data sets. This is really great for collaboration because if you're working on something with somebody else, you can break down these queries into multiple steps. On the back end, we're actually just running this as one big query. If I click on this kind of row count up here, you can see this is the compiled SQL. So this is what we actually submit to Snowflake. And in this case, we wrap up, or in all query mode cases, we wrap up this first query as a CTE here. So you can see what this looks like. And then we just query against that CTE with the second query. So we compile this CTE on the back end. It's really, really kind of elegant. It's simple, it's easy to understand, but it really helps with scaling and sharing this work across an organization. Also uh, for scaling up, we're really kind of under this theme of keeping work in the data warehouse. For Snowflake in particular, we have a really nice integration with Snowpark. So if I go over to my data source over here, the exact same way that I used my demo Snowflake here, I can use this connection to get a Snowpark session. This will generate 3 lines of code that outputs this session variable. This session variable is a Snowpark session. There's nothing hex specific about this. This is the starting point for most of Snowpark's documentation. So you can use the same connection. You can use all of the benefits of writing SQL, having the SQL cell. And when you flip over to wanting to do Snowpark, you can use that same connection. You don't have to manage like a JSON file or like find a way to hide your password or anything like that. That's all baked into Hex. You can just get going really quickly. And I'll show you something really cool to kind of show you what this looks like in practice. In this project, I have some Snowpark code. What it does is not super important. Just kind of know that this is Snowpark code that's all based on the session variable. And this is kind of a little bonus. I'm going to copy these cells from this project to my other project. If I highlight this, I can just Command C, and then I'll jump down here, and let's go delete this. Oh, it deleted the cell. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I'm messing it up. Okay. I'm doing something wrong. But you can copy cells from one cell to another. You can see here from this example that we have the Snowpark code. This is all just running against the session variable. Super straightforward. And at the end, we're printing this out. So anything that you want to do with Snowpark, it's easy to get started because we give this with your same connection. The last kind of element that I want to talk about in terms of scaling up is, even though we don't see this as a long-term kind of solution, you can just up the amount of memory that you have in your Hex environment. So right now I'm using 8 gigabytes. You can go up to 32 gigs of memory. If you needed more than this, you could reach out to us and we can work with you on that. This is great. This solves a lot of problems. I think that the data volume that we see in data warehouses scales much faster than anything that's practical to give to a client environment. So that's why kind of we're looking and pushing really good ways of pushing work to the data warehouse. But sometimes this is easiest, so we're happy to support that in Hex as well. Great. So the next set of things that I want to talk about is scale. Or sorry, not scale, state. And so that's going to be how how Hex cells are organized. Kind of what we see in Jupyter notebooks is cells run in lots of weird orders, and it's really hard to keep track of how they're related to each other, especially if you're sharing a project or a notebook with somebody else. It's really hard to have reproducible results. Like if somebody were to just send me a 100 cell IPYNB file, I'd be pretty lucky if that just ran, right? And a lot of that is because it's hard to keep track of how cells are related to each other. And so in Hex, over on the right side, we have this graph view. So this is a really quick, easy solution to like, how are these cells related to each other? You can see that we built out this DAG that keeps track of how all the variables created flow through a project. So like the example I've been using today has all been based on the SQL cell where I'm outputting purchases. And you can see that I'm picking up purchases in all of these places. Then these cells are generating their own variables, which are being passed to new or other downstream cells. So this is really great for interpretability. It's really great for troubleshooting if you've done something weird in your project. It's easy to go and see how these things are related. That logic of keeping track of variables is also really useful as you're working on a project, just in the notebook view. You can see here when I have purchases, there's this little 4 next to the variable that's created. And that is these 4 downstream cells that we're using these results in. So I can see all of those here. You can see this is where purchases is referenced. So if I click on display table, it'll automatically take me to the table display cell where I'm showing the purchases table. This is true of Python cells as well. So if I were to do something like x equals 1, you'll see that I have x here. And if I were to have something like y equals x plus 1, now you can see that this is referenced in that cell. This same logic also powers the way that cells run. So I'm going to add one more cell here to demonstrate this. Print y. You can see at the bottom of this project, I have run mode is set to auto. This will automatically run all of the cells in a chain. So if I were to update, say, this to x plus 2, when I run this, you'll see this downstream cell gets updated as well. Um, we can also set this so that it will update, or auto mode will also set it so that it will update its own dependencies when it runs as well. So it reran this, and it reran this to give you the final value of x of y equals 5. This is really, really helpful. It makes the experience of working in a hex notebook feel a lot more like a spreadsheet where all of the things are inherently related and they're kept up to date and in sync with each other. If for any reason you wanted a different run mode, you could just keep this to running cell and upstream, running cell and downstream, or then running cell only. And then the last kind of category of things that I want to talk about is sharing in Hex. So we see a lot of workflows in traditional notebooks hit a dead end or just get weird when it's time to share work out with other people. We see a lot of screenshots of like graphs and charts generated in Hex. But Hex, with this app functionality I talked about earlier, makes it really easy to generate something nice or to create something nice out of the notebook. If I command click and hit notebook here, I can pull up the split screen view. And you can see any of these elements that I've generated on the notebook side can easily be added to the app or removed from the app. So say I have this chart, maybe I decided I don't need everybody to see this chart. I don't want it to be part of my published app. I can take it out, but I wanted to add it back. I can just toggle it with this button over here. Once it's on the canvas, the app canvas, I can drag it around, resize it. And we provide some guides to make this lined up and to make it look really nice without a ton of effort. You can also build interactive elements into this. So you can see like drop-down menus, sliders here. And all of these create Python variables on the back end that you can build into your SQL and your Python cells so that all of these can talk to each other and build a really nice interactive experience. So the final product, once this is on the canvas and ready, you can access by hitting publish, and then is available here. And so this is what the final published app looks like. This is all backed by the SQL, Python, chart cells, all of the data tools on the notebook side, but it's much more polished. When you share this out, it's really a focus on what are the valuable results. These can all be permissioned. So when you're thinking about sharing this workout with other people, you can decide on the level of access that makes sense for them. There's 4 levels of permission here. There's permissions just for kind of stakeholders. That's going to be app only and can view, which is access to the app or access to the app and the read-only access to the notebook. And then there's can edit. And so the other side of sharing that we see is collaboration. Like, how do you work on a project with somebody else at the same time? Or if somebody else has done something, how can you build on what they've done? And so a lot of that's going to come from the can edit permissions. That's going to provide a really nice multiplayer experience on the notebook side of the project, where if you're working on a project and you've given somebody else edit access, it's going to feel like Google Docs. You can both work in the project at the same time. Everything is versioned automatically. So if somebody deletes something that you really needed, you can revert back and you can get that. But it really makes for a nice collaborative experience in Hex. And so, yeah, that's kind of the big things that I wanted to talk about today. So now we have time for questions. Yeah, well, we can do questions for the next 11 minutes. So the first question is, can you have more than one Hex notebook in a project? So I will take that. So no, in a project, in an individual project, you can just have a single notebook. But there's kind of 2 sides of of how you might think about this kind of from a consumer side and then from like a project organization standpoint. So one is inside of an app, you can set up tabs. So I can add tabs. So if you did want to organize your final app in pages, like you might think of like having multiple notebooks for different kind of aspects of your presentation, tabs is really good for that. If you're thinking about this more in terms of like we have like an initiative and we want to have multiple notebooks as part of that initiative, then inside of Hex, we have this feature called collections, which are a lot like folders for your project. So you can map this, like say we had a dumpling shack analysis initiative, this could contain multiple projects as part of it. Great. Are there any other questions? Happy to talk about anything that I've talked about as part of the demo or really anything about Hex in general. And let's see, what is available in the free version? Limited amount of licenses. I have a use case in mind. So the free version will limit the big ones are it's going to limit your ability to have workspace connections. So you'll just be able to, you can have like a data connection in your project, but you won't be able to share that across projects. And then you can only have 5 projects in a demo workspace. There's also some limits on like how much you can scale up your compute environment. But for the most part, the big ones are going to be the demo, the sorry, the workspace connections and the number of projects that you can have. Also, I should say we have this on our, I think there's yeah, on our pricing page, you can kind of see what's available in community and then the other tiers here. Cool. Let's see. Oh, so how to run Hex through a scheduler. So we have 2 things to show here. So one is we have a built-in scheduler in Hex. So over here on scheduled runs, you can see that I have one, like this project is set up to run every day at midnight Pacific time. You can set these up really easily as part of your project. I just go to scheduled runs, add, and you can see different rules. You can even write your own cron syntax if you'd like. And then you can set up notifications around this. So you can set up email notifications or Slack notifications based on different conditions of the project. And then you can set up who these go to. So this is great for built-in scheduling. We also have an API. You probably want to reference our documentation. That's going to be at learn.hex.tech to kind of get some examples of how to use the API. But the API pretty much do the same thing as the scheduler, but you can trigger those jobs to run from other places. I should mention that when you run those jobs, that's going to run the published version of the project. So you can almost think of publish, like the published app, the state of the project when you published it as like a production kind of branch. So you can make changes to this, but if you have things dependent on some kind of data workflow that you're doing from your API or scheduled job, that will all run and maintain as is until you click the publish button. See. So here's another question. Do teams typically have a GitHub repo for Hex projects, or is all the code stored directly in Hex? Um, so the code is going to be stored in Hex kind of either way, but we do have a Git integration as well. I would not say that most teams do this, but you certainly can. A lot of places like to have all of their code in like GitHub or GitLab. So for any of these projects, if you'd like, you can turn on Git sync. You can see that, like in this case, I might store it to a GitHub or a GitLab repo, and then I can say the path in that repo. This stores as this YAML file. This YAML file is pretty close to an IPYNB file, but was designed to be nicer in Git. Um, yeah, and then I should say, just while I'm talking about that a little bit, you can also directly import, or sorry, you can export any of your projects as a YAML file or an IPYNB file. And let's see. Does publishing a project compromise data security? Does it make the file publicly available online? So the publishing a project will make the project, sorry, I should say, it will make the published app available to whoever you grant that published app access to. So kind of the broadest version of this might be this share to web. This, I would say for probably like half of our customers or our users is turned off entirely at the organization level. So if you're aware that we don't want anybody to be able to do this at all, you can just turn off the share to web functionality. So at that point, things can only be shared inside of an organization. Nothing can be shared with anybody who doesn't have a Hex login for your organization. Um, and so then that obviously limits the scope of who'd be able to see things. And then within any individual project, like I could send this to pretty much anybody. You can't act like if you set this up with code, or sorry, if you set this up with permissions such that you only have app only access, those users who have app only access won't be able to see any of the code here. They'll strictly only be able to see the things that are available to them in this project or in this app view. So you could have, I mean, this, I don't know that I would recommend doing this, but you could do like print sensitive data example. You could print out sensitive data here. As long as it's not on your published app, nobody who you share just the app with will be able to see it. If you were to share this with somebody who has can edit access, then they'd be able to access the notebook and they might see this. And that's kind of where the different levels of permissions come in. Cool. Yeah. Any other questions? Also, are there any ideas for what a future topic for how to hex would be? We have another one coming at the end of the month that's going to be about DBT. And then after that, yeah, I mean, we're still brainstorming, so happy to take suggestions on that. So since we have a minute, I'll definitely still be looking for questions, but I'll just cover a couple other things I didn't really get time to dig into. Oh, one more. Interested in learning about more about Hex and Snowpark. Do you have any specific, oh, future topic, like a full session? That's great. Perfect. Yeah, that seems like a really good idea. Yeah, we'll definitely take note of that. Um, Great. Yeah. So here, I'll cover chart cells really quick just because I didn't really fit into our natural workflow, but I think this is a really good, helpful thing that we offer kind of beyond traditional notebooks as well. So there's the full SQL workflow that I've talked about kind of a lot today. But we also have these chart cells, and this is a way of building visualizations in Hex without having to write any code. You can, of course, always fall back on writing whatever you'd like to do in Python, but we also have this really nice visualize in chart. You can see here that I can take the SQL output that I generated earlier from my SQL cell. I just do visualize and chart, or I could start from a chart cell over here. And this will just take a data frame that you have. So let's do purchases over here. It'll give you some different options for different visualizations you might want to do. So I'm just going to do a line chart. And then you can see like really quickly it does category and sales, but I want to do this by date. Let's do this by, let's do by month. Sure. And we can keep sales, and you can split this out by different categories. So I have a different line for each category. So there's a ton of options here in terms of colors. You can stack different visualizations on top of each other. There's a lot that you can do with this, but it's designed to be really, really straightforward to go from writing a query, getting a result, and then generating a visualization. Since it's based on the data frames, you can also do this with any Python or Pandas output that you might have in Hex. They can also be made interactive so that, like in this case, my purchases down here can return a data frame called selection. So you can filter the data down based on interactivity inside of the chart cell. So this is really, really great. Just kind of working with data and digging into it, but then also when you think about sharing out apps, creating interactive elements for your consumers. And so one more question here, is there a way to control app execution? For example, putting expensive calculations behind a button. Yes. Well, so there's a couple different things to do this. On the notebook side, if you really wanted to like cut things down, you could just switch to cell only, and then this will only run individual cells that you pick. On the app side, if you're thinking about constructing an app and you want to put something behind a button, there's a couple ways you could do this. There is a run mode where you can just you can require that users, I don't have an example here, but you can require that nothing runs until a user clicks a run button up here, or you could manually build a run button into your project with this. And then this will create a Boolean that would be like, let's just do print input 1. So right now it's false. If I click this, oh, here, let me set this to auto. If I click this now, it's going to be true. So while it's not clicked, it's false. And then when it's clicked, it's true. And so that would be a way of kind of putting calculations behind a button that way. Great. So it's 10:30 now. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining today. Really appreciate the questions, and definitely reach out to us if you have any more, have suggestions for what we should cover on the next How to Hex.